So we're going to do a Bible study on First and Second Corinthians. How did I pick these texts? As sort of the first question. Why are we doing this? Get this in any class. What's the point of the class? Well, there are a couple things that led me to think of this. One is we have some precedent within the Lutheran tradition for when there is terrible illness, let's all just do Bible study. In Luther's day, the plague ripped through Wittenberg, and they had to shut down the university. And Luther's home was a huge home. It was home to many of the university students, and so they were doing their own version of stay at home. And Luther decided, well, when we're stuck at home, what else do I do? I'm basically what today we would call an Old Testament professor. And so Luther decided he's going to lecture on the Bible. Now, Luther lectured on whatever books he felt like, so he lectured on 1 John, that letter in the New Testament. Well, we need to stay at home, and we can meet remotely. Thank goodness you're not all crammed into my house. You'd all be very tired of that, probably before I would. But we'd all be tired of it pretty quick. But we're going to do remote Bible study just as our forebears in the faith did when illness required that. So that's one reason why I thought let's do this. But why Corinthians? And that's something. There are a couple reasons for that. First is that Corinth in the first century, when Paul would have written to them, was probably the community of all the ones that Paul wrote to where we still have letters, is probably the one most like the United States. It's hardly like the United States, but it's the most like the United States. Corinth was settled primarily, it had been sort of reinvigorated by the Romans, but was settled by veterans of the Roman legions who had been made citizens and were given hefty pensions and allowed to settle there. And so Corinth was a very patriotic place. And the United States is probably one of the more patriotic countries out there. Even Americans who complain about America probably say more glowing things about America than most other countries will see their citizens say about their countries. So it's a very patriotic place. The class structure in Corinth, while very real, was built more on financial power than on ancient families, and that's another similarity with America. Our class system is real here. It's not the same as the one you'd get, say, in Great Britain, where it has to do with pedigree and bloodlines. Here, the class system is rooted in your financial success, and that would have been more the case in Corinth. They still had a very strong class system, but it came from success in business more than it did from being old money. And that's more like America is, more like our world is. And finally, Corinth is business-oriented. It sits on the Isthmus of Corinth that connects mainland Greece to the Peloponnesian Peninsula. Massive shipping industry running through there. Boats would land on either side and then be dragged across the narrow isthmus. And so this is an important conduit for trade in the old days. And so business was important. And again, America is very much a business-oriented country. So that's one reason, is Corinth is of the communities the most like the United States. There are some other challenges in Corinth that I think are especially timely for us. The issues in Corinth revolve around a community that's trying to figure out how to live together. There are patron-client relations, honor-shame relations. How do you live in the gospel rather than following whatever the strict rules of law are? And how do you celebrate your life together in this way? Those things are probably very foreign to us, and we'll talk about some of those in a minute, but they would have made up how the world was put together. Patron-client relations were the norm. Honor-shame system was the norm. Following purity regulations was the norm. Paul is going to be writing against a lot of these things, and the Corinthians are trying to figure out how to live once those rules aren't there. We today live in a world that is very natural to us, that we don't even think about. We live in this sort of neoliberal order where everything is done for a profit. Everything is, anything that can be commodified is. Your productivity is how your worth is measured. A lot of us are, well, what are we doing now? We're sitting at home. We're not productive, ergo we are worthless. This would not necessarily have been the way people thought. My great-grandparents on their farm, what are they doing in the winter months when there's nothing else to do? They're not worried about their productivity. They're just trying to stay alive and deal with productivity when there's time to do that. But for us today, if you're not being productive, you're a drag on the system. And our neoliberal order, and we'll talk more about that when we're able to talk face-to-face, but our neoliberal order so permeates reality that even using the word neoliberal kind of gets the eye rolls or gets the laughs, like you're suggesting that somehow you're suggesting something ridiculous, merely suggesting that things could be or were different than they are, gets you shouted down. Many of us alive today can remember a time when society was structured differently than it is now. But our society tries really hard to make you think its current way of doing things is the only one. Well, Paul's society was built in a way that was the only way anybody had ever known. Paul is offering something different, and that's running into trouble as people say, we're not seeing it, Paul. Or, we kind of like the way things work, we just wanted a few little changes. So that's something that resonates, I think, with us today. Also, the church in Corinth almost certainly met in a house. It was probably a pretty big house, but it was a house. And for the foreseeable future, we are meeting from our houses. So those are some reasons why we'll talk about Corinth. Few things to know before we really dig in, and things to know before we have our conversation on Thursday. The first is, as I mentioned, patron-client relationships. In those days, everybody was a client of somebody, and many people were patrons to others. The top patron in that Greco-Roman world would have been Jupiter, the king of the gods. He would have been assumed to be the patron. And patrons are those to whom you owe allegiance. You give them financial support. You work to build up their honor and their status in the community. You vote for them and make sure others vote for them. You support them in what they want to do, and you give them whatever they ask of you. Most people were not patrons, but there were lots of people were. There were layers of patronage. Jupiter would have been the patron of the emperor, and the emperor would have had clients who depended on him, but they in turn would have been patrons of other people. The average person probably was client to somebody. If you did not have a patron, you were basically somebody who did not exist. You were a nobody. You were on the very edge of survival, quickly on your way to death. Most of us would have been clients in those days, and we would have been very grateful for our client status. If you figure our city, the Greater Valparaiso, were to be a Latin city in those days, well, there would be major families that ran the show. But unlike today, everyone would have belonged somehow to one of those families. You're either directly the client of them, or you're the client of one of their clients. And your job is to make sure those families get the support that they demand of you, and that they get the honor that they want in the system. And this is how your whole world is put together. There were many slaves in this system. Slavery, two things need to be said about slavery. It's slavery. People own people. All right, this is not cool. It's not the kind of slavery that we experienced in North America, where a particular racial construct was determined, where whiteness was was determined as how you can't possibly be enslaved. And then there were degrees of non-whiteness that could allow you to be enslaved, to where blacks were the enslaved ones. Rome didn't know that kind of racial slavery. It is still slavery. People were owned. People were to be let out of slavery eventually. That was one of the ways you gained honor, was by freeing your slaves. It was the sacrifice you've made of letting your slave go brought you honor. So that was seen to be an important thing. It is still a piece of reality. But slaves fit into this hierarchy of patrons and clients. If a really wealthy patron is receiving clients, and in walks a slave of that patron's patron, they're going to stop and listen to that slave. That slave has something important to tell them from their own boss. So it's a more complicated system than maybe what we're accustomed to thinking about. But these folks are still slaves. So that patron-client relation, that's going to be important in the Corinthian correspondence. It's part of how the world functions. It's part of what Paul's trying to change, at least within the church in Corinth. Honor and shame, another big one. I've talked about patron-client in sermons before, and I've talked about honor and shame in sermons. Honor is almost as important as money in that society. This is like currency. Men gain or lose honor either by upholding their patrons, or having their clients uphold them, or by failing at things that should have gained them honor. Shame is something that is this is the woman's job, is to bear shame. Women carry the shame of a family around. This is, again, something that's our contemporary sensibilities. So this is horrible, and I agree that it is. But this is the way things would have been put together in those days. If there's shame that attaches to a family over something, this adheres to the women, and there are different means of removing the shame, and they're mostly bad and mostly for the women. Life revolves around acquiring honor, and acquiring honor for yourself, for your family, and for your patron and his broader family, and removing shame from the family and from the patron's family. That's probably even more important, like I said, more important than money. You can parlay your honor into a lot of support if things go wrong for you financially. Money, that's nothing compared to having powerful connections that say, oh, you're one of mine. Final kind of background note here is that dinner was extremely important. I agree with that even today, but in those days, dinner and with whom you dined was extremely important. Dinner encoded status. Who invited you to dinner and where you sat in relation to them determined how important or unimportant you were. And supper clubs were very popular throughout the empire. Everyone who was anyone attended at least one supper club, and these could be dedicated to debates. They could be dedicated to various gods and goddesses. And these were the societies that you took part in their world, and those societies had important social functions. They would sponsor public works, and they would fight for honor of their own members and of their patrons. And so this was how your identity was formed. And so the church in Corinth is grappling with what to do about meals that encode status, especially when you've got a church that is built around a rather distinct meal, and those meal practices seem to be part of the issue that's going on in that community. So that's some background here. A couple quick things to mention, though, as we get ready for talking about this in our first session. Those of you who've been doing Bible study with us know that we've used these terms of the three worlds that revolve around the text. There's the world of the text, which is the world that the text presents. There's a world in front of the text. That's our world as we read this text and all the stuff we bring to interpreting the text. And there's a world behind the text. It's all the things that would have been known to the author and perhaps to its first readers, that maybe we don't know necessarily, but we can reconstruct with a degree of certainty, varying degrees of certainty, shall we say. Clearly, the world of the Corinthian correspondence is its letters. And we're starting with 1 Corinthians. We believe that 1 Corinthians is all of one letter that Paul wrote to a church in Corinth. So the world of the text is we're reading Paul's mail to Corinth. World in front of the text, we're at stay at home in the midst of a pandemic. That's the world in front of it. We're going to bring that to it each time we read it. One thing to mention of the world behind the text is that we know from 1 Corinthians 5, verse 9, that Paul had already written one letter to the church in Corinth. And we'll deal with that when we get to it. But for now, it's important that we remember, this is not the first time Paul has already written to them. The text of that letter no longer exists. We don't know its entire contents. When we get to the part where Paul mentions it, we'll talk about what he says he wrote. But Paul's already been in touch with this church, and he's already been in touch with them about problems that he's facing. So this is not the first time he's had to talk to them. For our first session, we're going to read 1 Corinthians 1, verses 1 to 17. It's just like about the first half of the first chapter. It's a good way to get our feet wet and to look at what Paul is doing. I have 3 chunks of text for us to look at and 3 things for you all to think about before we have our first conversation. Verses 1 to 3. How does Paul identify himself? What are the titles he uses? How do you understand those? What do you think they mean? Use your best guesses on this. What's the best understanding? What is Paul saying about himself? Why might he identify himself in this way? Second, verses 4 to 9. This part of the letter, part of most letters that were not meant to be sacred texts, this is just Paul writing, would have been a thanksgiving. It's considered polite to give thanks for something, don't just cut to the chase. This is the small talk portion, but it's important small talk. It sets a tone. It establishes the mood that the author is in. So this is the thanksgiving Paul has written. Try to put in your own phrasing, what is it Paul is telling the Corinthians that gives him cause to give thanks for them? Why would he start his letter with this thanksgiving? He's not just wasting ink. This is what he wants to tell them. So why? Why is Paul giving thanks for this in particular? Finally, verses 10 through 17. This is the official start of the letter. This is when we get down to business. Again, in your own phrasing, what's going on? This is where Paul tells us why the whole rest of the letter is there. What's happening? Find your own way to phrase that. When we get back together, we'll start with those 3 things, and we'll go from there. So I look forward to talking to as many of you as can take part in Zoom on Thursday evening. And those of you who can't, we will be posting things on the Facebook group and trying our best to do that. This is all new to all of us, how to do Bible study in a pandemic. And I'm one of those Gen Xers who, I grew up having to use technology, but I also tried not to. So I'm learning this as we go along. I look forward to doing it with you. If you have any questions, drop me a line. Facebook, email, text, whatever. I'll get back to you as best I can, possibly with a coherent answer. So, thank you.